Hey, it's Natalie. This is my last episode as guest host of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. And I have a great conversation with Joanne Baumgartner, the executive director of Wild Farm Alliance, to share with you. But first, I want to thank all of you who have listened to the podcast. It sometimes feels like scattering seeds and not knowing what will grow. We put these conversations out there, and the only way I know if something has taken root is if someone tells me. It happens every now and then, and it's very rewarding to know that using this platform to share the knowledge and experience of these amazing guests has inspired someone to try something or created a deeper understanding that could lead to some future innovation. Or even just knowing that these conversations have kept you all company while you're doing dishes or deliveries. I know I've said it before, but I want to say again how appreciative I am to Jesse, Jackson, Michelle, and Michael for making this all happen. I also listen to podcasts, and I know that ads can be annoying, but the fact that they have worked so hard to keep this content all available without a paywall is really admirable. It's hard, so thank you. For my last episode, it was an honor to talk with Joanne. Wild Farm Alliance is celebrating 25 years of working to promote healthy, viable agriculture that helps protect and restore wild nature. You can get involved with their work if you have or are interested in having nest boxes or raptor perches on your farm. And then your farm can be included on the very cool flyways trail that they've got on their website. After our conversation, I have some thoughts about the state of agricultural research and funding that I'd like to share with you all, even though it makes me a little uncomfortable to do so. I just feel like I have to say something, but I'm not putting it up top. I'm going to make it after our conversation. So if you're interested, please listen to the end. Here is my conversation with Joanne.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/no-till. Today's episode is also brought to you by ASAP, Appalachian Sustainable Agriculture Project. ASAP, Appalachian Sustainable Agriculture Project, will offer the Business of Farming Conference on Saturday, February 22nd in Asheville, North Carolina. This annual conference brings together professional and aspiring farmers from across the Southeast to network and share resources to build viable farm businesses. Scholarships for BIPOC and limited resource farmers are available, as well as discounts for farm partners registering together. Registration opens in mid-November. Find out more at asapconnections.org. That's asapconnections.org. All right, enjoy the show.
I am very excited to have you here. And I like to start with just kind of an introduction. So this is as much, I think, about you as it is about the Wild Farm Alliance. You have just this wealth of experience and knowledge in agriculture and conservation. So I'd love to hear about how you originally got into farming, what that looked like in the 80s in California, and how you eventually transitioned to the Wild Farm Alliance.
Well, in the early 80s, I started working on this conventional research farm where we were putting treated wastewater on crops. That was because there was saltwater intrusion coming in from the coast and they needed another water source. And so I learned how to farm in a lot of ways from these experts, but they also used a crazy amount of pesticides. They were like a 30-day lettuce crop. Like once you transplant it, it's only in there 30 days, they'd spray 5 different pesticides on it. So after that 5-year project, my husband and I started our own organic farm, and did that for a dozen years in the 80s and 90s. And we grew all kinds of crops. We were growing about 40 different crops, plus flowers. And we're coastal in the Central California coast where you can grow year round. And so we were always planting every couple of weeks. We'd plan and have a new planting. And I remember in the first time I heard that Cal Organic had planted 10 acres of broccoli. And we were like, oh no, that's going to flood the market, because we were planting like one row of broccoli, every 2 weeks. And we were selling to farmers markets, but the local natural food stores too. And so, obviously that worked itself out. But at some point I decided to go back to school, and I had always been enamored with birds and wanted to study how they were helping with pest control. So looked at birds eating codling moth in apple orchards and found that super fascinating. And they're just ambassadors for the wild. They help with pest control, and they're delightful. And so after that, I started working for Wild Farm Alliance. That was in 2001. And yeah, I've been here since then.
I want to get back to your fascination with birds, because that still drives a lot of your work. But I also want to linger a little bit longer on what your farming experience was like. So I read an interview that you did in 2010, and you talked about sort of how you started and then how you grew. Like you didn't have land really. So how you grew and what that scale looked like. So I think this is a struggle that a lot of farmers face in terms of what is the economically viable scale.
Yeah. Well, we started off with an acre and a half, and then we got 3 acres. And back then we were making $100,000 on 3 acres. And it was pretty amazing. I mean, and we had learned how to grow good produce, and pack it well. And so we weren't having a problem selling any of it. It was super intense, take out one crop, put in another. And then we got another piece in this valley that was right up against a nature reserve that was full of deer. and that was actually a bad move, because it wasn't fit. The 7 acres was not fenced. We had then 10 acres total, and we couldn't afford to fence it. And so we had to change our palette of what we were growing. We couldn't grow stuff that the deer ate. And, by that time we were like, oh, you were kind of pushing a ball uphill. And I decided to go back to school.
Let's get into the birds. And I think it is just the question is just why birds, sort of for you personally, but then also ecologically, why birds and farms?
Birds they're under-recognized as beneficial. Their job from their perspective is to go and find food to eat. And often that food are pests, and they're eating insects and they're eating rodents. And so we can both support them for their own sake, but also benefit from them. And so there are some nuances in that, but generally, that's the case. And so while birds often get a bad rap, like I used to be, before we started working on this topic, farmers would every time I brought up birds, they'd have to tell me how terrible they were. But after we put together this comprehensive guide of all these 120 studies around the world and how 90% of them show birds are beneficial, farmers are like, oh yeah, well, I have seen them carrying insects in their beaks. And
what were the things that farmers would say were terrible about them? Like the one thing that comes to mind that fruit and berry growers often complain about is the cedar waxwings. But what else?
Well, there's a few birds that can cause a lot of problems. And so there's starlings and blackbirds and these waxwings, they flock. And the thing and some of them come in huge flocks. And So if you're a huge flock of birds, you're going to look for a huge amount of food. And so these big monocultures of crops are what they're looking for, as opposed to a diversified farm that has some strawberries, but has a lot of different stuff. There's not enough to eat for that big flock of birds. And instead, there's going to be a diverse community of birds. And sure, there might be some birds that are coming in from the edges, but they don't come in very far because they have a different way of keeping themselves safe. They use cover, so they're only going to come so far out from cover, whereas these big flocking birds, they stay safe by being in a big flock. And so it really depends. And here in California, there are 5 birds that have been studied that, are the most terrible birds, or what farmers say are the worst birds, out of like 600 that occur here in the state. So that's what I mean by, they get that there's a few birds that give all birds a bad name, but really there's so many birds that are beneficial, or maybe they aren't helping the farm, but they stay out in the woods and have the function there too, to keep those ecosystems healthy.
And I think most of the listeners to this podcast are probably, bird lovers. That tends to be their inclination. But I sort of think of it like with nematodes. Like if people have only heard of the bad nematodes, they might not realize that there's this whole ecosystem of nematodes, and they fall in different places in the food chain. And so similarly with birds, can you talk a little bit more about, like you mentioned, they eat insects, they eat rodents, also seeds. I think I know a lot of weed scientists, and I think seed predation is kind of an undervalued ecosystem service of birds. So can you just talk a little bit more about where they fit in the ecosystem of a farm?
Well, depending on the bird, because birds have different niches. Some birds are like bluebirds, fit really well into systems where there's some grassland on a farm, or like a vineyard where there's grass in between the crop, or some kind of cover, because that's where they're hunting. They're hunting down on the ground or in the lower parts of the bushes, the crop. There's other birds, like where I studied, birds, arboreal birds that are in trees, like woodpeckers, and their job is to look for insects on the depending on that. Some birds are looking like on the bark mostly, and some of them, like woodpeckers, and some of them are gleaning the leaves, like some warblers. And but they have these different niches, and so you can support them by providing what they need on the farm. Farmers can put in, like bluebirds, you can attract with nest boxes. You can also support some kinds of arboreal birds, and nuthatches help with pest control, and chickadees you can support in orchards. And then here in California, we have, and actually across the world, barn owls are one of the most common birds around, and you can support them with nest boxes. And there's been a ton of really cool research that, like, a pair of barn owls and their nestlings will eat 3,400 rodents a year.
So to put that in like a context for me, how many, like on a typical farm, how many rodents are there per acre or something like that? Like what does that do to the population of rodents? Because I don't have a number on the top of my head. That sounds like a lot of rodents.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that if there's a whole bunch of rodents on the farm, the barn owls are not going to have a great impact at taking that level down. But if they're at not too high of a level, they'll keep the level really low. So if it's, and the thing about nature, most predators don't take out the very last thing they're going to eat. So because then there would be, their population would go up, and then it would go down, and then it would go up, and it's much so. But farmers can manage rodents with barn owls, and by also doing stuff like keeping the ground cover from getting really high, because it's harder for the birds to get in there and catch the rodents. The birds will fly a couple of miles on average from their nest box. So they're not just staying on the farm, but some studies show that they'll spend, like in vineyards in Napa County, they'll spend about 30% of their time in the vineyard. So even if that 3,400 bird rodents, only a third of it is being eaten on the farm, that's still a lot.
And just keeping them in check. And again, like it's not that you would want to eliminate rodents completely, because they also have a role. Again, I come back to that, like weed seed predation. They do some good things, ecosystem services. And it was interesting. I was also reading through some of your materials, and I'm getting a little farther from my intended outline here, but I was reading some of the materials, and you said that there's actually a lot of data to show that rodents in the field do not pose a food safety risk. They may affect food quality, but not food safety. And so I thought that was really interesting.
I think you're referring to this study where they were looking at habitat and what is supported. If you get rid of all, like in the Salinas Valley, where the food safety contamination was first, exploded on the scene, so to speak, in 2006. In response, the buyers said, you got to take out all the habitat. So if all you have is the crop, this study shows that you're going to have a lot of deer mice, as opposed to if you have habitat, you're not just going to have deer mice, you're going to have this community of different kinds of mice, and they don't hang out together. They all have their separate niches and ways that they share. The species hang out within themselves, but not across species. So when you have just one species of deer mice, they can they share pathogens throughout the big community, and so you're going to have a lot by numbers. If there is any pathogen problem, those deer mice in those denuded fields are going to have a higher incidence of or cause the farm to have a higher risk of pathogens and potential contamination. There's some great research coming out of UC Davis that where they looked at I want to say I don't know, 500,000. It was maybe even more samples because after the contamination, some companies were tracking exactly. They were sampling everything that they were selling. And anyway, so they take all these samples and they compared to was there a food safety issue with any of them, and where this crop was grown. And they found that taking out habitat did not make food safer, and in fact, it made it less safe. So the whole thing, I know you asked about, well, what's going on? It's the buyers that are the buyers really driving what's happening? And they don't really care about the science. They want, complete control. And they think that the way they can get it is by having these pretty sterile farmscapes, when In fact, we worked for years helping FDA and others understand, or we worked with others, understand how important conservation is. And so when, for food safety, so when FDA published its Food Safety Modernization Act, they said you don't have to take out habitat, you don't have to fence out wildlife, and sustainable conservation supports food safety. And that's because like windbreaks help to filter airborne pathogens, grasses and wetlands filter waterborne pathogens, and soil biodiversity. The biodiversity antagonizes, attacks, and displaces pathogens because the overwhelming majority of the foodborne pathogens don't live in the soil, or they can exist there, but they don't thrive there. So nature has these built-in ways that we can adapt and bring back to the farm and make farms safer.
And have the buyers changed their policies as well? That was one of my questions, because I had not realized that it was the buyers largely driving the changes after the 2006 outbreak.
Well, in general, no, but it depends. And so when we say buyers, I mean like the big buyers that are selling lots of produce, as opposed to, if you're buying or the local natural food store might buy your produce. And I'm not talking about them, but if you're a large farmer and you need to sell wholesale, for the most part, these buyers in areas like the Salinas Valley and other places where fresh produce is grown, they are really skittish. However, there's a really interesting thing happening because the buyers are enamored with regenerative, and not that they all know or agree what that means, but regenerative and sustainable. And so some of the big buyers, like Walmart, for instance, has a mandate that farms have to be more sustainable, and they have this list of things that the farmers have to do. And at the same time, that's like one arm of this huge buyer industry. And then the other arm is saying, yes, but you have to have food safe. So right now, we are part of a group of bunch of NGOs and researchers. We're all trying to figure out, like, how do we educate these buyers? Because the farmers there's a bunch of organic farmers involved, because they feel like they're really they've always been between a rock and a hard place, but it's just getting crazier. But there's an opportunity to, educate these people now that they want these have conflicting goals.
They want zero risk, which is unattainable. And so how do you educate about minimizing risk, really?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, a farm is not an industrial processing plant.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Ohio Earth Food. If you grow plants, you know that to a farm of any size, your soil is your most steadfast partner, an asset worthy of investing in. Since 1972, Ohio Earth Food has been the go-to source for the highest performing and most cost-effective granular and liquid fertilizers, seed starting soils, foliar sprays, and disease and insect controls, all approved for use on organic farms. They deliver them right to your farm, too. Don't count on luck this year. Start your seeds in their Plant Pro and the Seed Catapult potting soils, and put their ReVita fertilizers in your soil before you plant, and rest assured that your plants will have all the nutrients, stimulants, and energy for whatever comes their way. These natural blends utilize compost, kelp, and humate, and are low salt index safe for high tunnels. Feed your soils and let your soil feed the plants. Visit them at ohioearthfood.com, now with branches in Ohio and Wisconsin. ohioearthfood.com. All right, back to the show.
we can come back to this, but I did want to transition to a really interesting topic for me because I used to be an organic inspector. And when I took my organic inspector training course, there's a lot of focus on the organic systems plan. I'm sure a lot of listeners, have filled that out, the OSP. And there is a lot more attention, or this was 15 years ago, more than, but there was a lot more attention paid, I thought, to making sure farms were not using prohibited substances. Like that was the big thing. Look for if there's evidence of herbicide use, look in the cabinet to see if there's prohibited insecticides and that kind of stuff, but not a lot of attention to the biodiversity requirements. And so if you could talk about like what are the goals of the National Organic Program and the organic standards in terms of biodiversity, and what has Wild Farm Alliance been doing to improve the state of biodiversity assessments?
The National Organic Program requires biodiversity conservation, and they require that farmers maintain or improve their natural resources, and they spell out what that means: it's soil, water, but also wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. And so we were approached by IOIA, the Inspector Trainer Group, and asked right after the rule became law in the early 2000s, and they said, "Hey, can you help us train inspectors?" And that took us on this long and winding path where we educated inspectors and organic farmers and organic certifiers about what does that mean. And we looked all through not just those pieces of the regulation, but all throughout the regulation. There actually is a lot to do with biodiversity and natural resources. And at the same time, we were educating the National Organic Program staff and the National Organic Standards Board, the group that guides the USDA on how they should ensure, the rule is being
implemented. No, yeah, I know what you're trying to say, like how to write the standards so that it is in the spirit of the law, because there is a law. Maybe people don't know that, but there's a law passed by Congress in, I don't know, 1990 or something. I'll look that up.
I think there was an act. It was 1990, and then in 2002 was the law, or the implementation of the act, and that's where the NOP came in and said, "Okay, well, this is the regulations." So what happened was we published early 2000s. We published a biodiversity guide for farmers and certifiers, and kept pushing and pushing the NOP. And with some NOSB members, we finally in 2016 got the NOP, got USDA to write guidance on what this means to conserve biodiversity and protect natural resources. And that was a huge win, because guidance is just describes, here's what the regulation really means. And so certifiers that were being really lax on this, it spelled it out. However, even though that happened, we were at the same time, we were working with certifiers and helping them update their organic system plans, the form the farmers fill out. And that was going pretty well. But at some point, we realized that it really didn't matter what the OSP said, because the inspection reports all said, is biodiversity here? Check mark, and that was it. And so the inspectors didn't do anything about it. And so We feel like we really helped the organic community address biodiversity conservation. And now when you talk to an organic farmer, biodiversity, the word biodiversity often rolls off their tongue. Whether or not they know what it means or not is another thing. And it really depends on who's certifying them, because some certifiers are much better at addressing this issue and helping farmers learn about it, sharing our materials, sharing others' materials, and certifiers are like, not there.
And is that something that it just they don't show an interest, or why? And how can we change that? Because it seems like an issue if the USDA organic label doesn't mean the same thing from one certification agency to the next. Because for what it's worth, like I wouldn't say it's not a burden, but it is an extra thing that farmers need to do or have to do. So they should, it should mean something.
We worked with organic inspectors for quite some time, trying to get them up to speed. And then we've just really broadened our perspective and goals, and work with all kinds of growers. We always have, but we're working with many more kinds of growers now. So I don't know the answer to that exactly. I hope that as much it's coming from the organic farmers themselves, like this group that helped start your podcast. There's a lot of growers that care about stewardship, and they want to see that implemented. So
I think that's a great point about, it's not necessarily whether farmers are certified or whether they're big or small, but there are farmers of sort of all stripes who are interested in biodiversity. And that gets me to one of my questions, which is, what have you found are the most successful methods for getting farmers interested and invested in implementing conservation practices?
We really try and find the most interesting science around this topic and make it accessible to farmers. We share the benefits of biodiversity. They need to stay in business. So we come at it from that perspective. Like, why would you put up nest boxes? Because these birds eat thousands of insects or rodents. And why would you put in habitat? And we go into all of these details, not just for birds. Like, we just published a guide on habitat for predatory and parasitoid insects. Excuse me. So we're really trying to meet the growers' needs and also help them understand how, when they do support wild nature, they are helping to address the biodiversity crisis, and they're helping to address the climate crisis. So I think growers they look to us now because we are providing a lot of information that maybe they knew was happening, but they didn't know the science behind it. And that's what we try and do is make information accessible in an actionable way.
Yeah. And I noticed that you have courses also for ag service providers. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Right now, we have a course on whole farm pest management. And so that stretches from soil biodiversity to above ground biodiversity, and how you support that and what are the benefits, and just lots of fascinating stuff. We find researchers that are addressing stuff like this organism. It's a fungus that you can spray it on plants, and
is it the gray mold one that you're talking about? The one that kills gray mold?
Well, I was thinking of Bavaria Bossiana, but I don't know if that's how you say it. And anyways, what happens is it kills pest insects, and then those pest insects are on the plant, and the plant can absorb some of the nutrients. And it's like, what? I mean, a pesticide is helping with nutrition, and pesticide in quotes, it's a natural organism. Or there's another cool study where this biodiverse soil in an organic farm had tomato plants producing salicylic acid, which is like aspirin, and it was keeping the leafhoppers away, whereas the farm next door was conventional, and it was covered inundated with leafhoppers, and they didn't have that biodiverse soil. They didn't have the salicylic acid, and so stuff like that is like we are learning about things we knew intuitively, but now we're starting to understand it more fully. And there's still a lot we don't understand, but nature is fascinating.
So one of the things I like about the Wild Farm Alliance website is that you have done a lot to visualize the work that you're doing. And so like this Flyways project. And so I'm wondering, and also as you mentioned, you've done a lot to quantify, like this is how many boxes and this is how many insects, and I love that. So could you talk a little bit about the 2050 vision for the Wild Farm Alliance and how it builds on what you've done for the first 25 years of your existence?
Yeah, we have our vision includes flyways, wildways, and waterways. So the flyways part is we want to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms. And if 10% of the farms did that, they would have an average of 5 of those structures on their farms. And then for wildways, we want to see 500,000 miles, hedgerows to the moon and back, of hedgerows and other kinds of edgy buffers on farms. And that number is the same amount of hedgerows that used to be in the UK before industrial ag moved in. And if they can do it, we certainly can do it. And when you have all this habitat, it's much easier for beneficial insects to move into the farm and get to where they need to be. So that's an obvious benefit. And then we want to see waterways. We want to see 100,000 miles of waterways restored. And they are super important for biodiversity, and that biodiversity can both, as the climate changes, it'll have areas of connectivity so they can move, which they're going to need to do. And also biodiversity comes out from those riparian areas and can help with pest control and pollination, and those river habitats filter water and help keep our systems clean and the aquatic organisms healthy. So so it's kind of a whole picture of habitat on the farm.
And what areas of the country do you currently work?
We are in California. We also work in the Midwest. We have a few staff there, and we're up in Oregon. However, staff there, but we work across the country, and it just depends on, we have a project up in New York, and it just depends on who's doing what and who our partners are and what we're trying to achieve.
And I don't want to bring this conversation down, but I do think it's important. What it seems like a lot of folks are facing some funding uncertainty. What have been your funding sources, and what are the funding sources that farmers themselves are using to implement these practices on their farms?
Our funding comes from individual donors, foundations, state funding, and federal funding. With what's going on right now is not a good thing. We are really concerned that the USDA, which Natural Resource Conservation Service is a part, is they're losing so many staff, and it's really concerning. Staff that maybe they were hired but on probation, or staff that were going to be hired, any contracts they were gonna implement. So it's really troubling because NRCS has a lot of money that they have dedicated to helping farms with conservation. And so we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but we are hoping that things are going to straighten out soon, because we often send farmers to NRCS for help with conservation. We here in California, we are really lucky that there's been a lot of funding focused on climate practices that help like store carbon in woody hedgerows, for instance. There's been a lot of support for that, and or just habitat in general, like putting in pollinator habitat. We have some funds to do that kind of work and help growers with conservation plans. So we're hoping California can be a model for many other states where they can also support growers putting in climate-friendly conservation practices.
Yeah. And in terms of the costs of installing these practices, is it typically, a lot of labor costs, or buying the plants or the machine work, or what is it?
One of the things we like to start farmers out on, if they're interested, is nest boxes. Like a bluebird nest box, it's not very much money. You can probably buy them on the internet for, I want to say, $30 or something. And putting up nest boxes, you start to see, or if you're paying attention, you'll start to see during nesting season birds coming in with their beaks loaded with insects. And in any case, that's a really inexpensive way. Putting in habitat is like growing a crop. You have to take care of it. You have to order the plants. You have to put them in a good spot, and make sure that there's not going to be any deer eating them, or rabbits, or and you've got to make, here in the West, you have to make sure they're irrigated. We mulch them so there's very little weeds. And so that all does cost money. And so ideally, farmers get enrolled in a program to help them with those costs. Over time, they reap the costs back. There was a study showing how for a 1,000-foot hedgerow, it takes 7 years to recoup both the pollinator and pest control benefits. However, if you got funding from NRCS, which pays for half of the costs, it would take half the time, like 3.5 years. And then on average, this was in tomato fields, they were getting about $600 a year of benefit from that hedgerow. We are quantifying, the value of these plantings, and growers are really clamoring for this support here in California. And I know NRCS is historically been oversubscribed. They can't support enough growers. So
yeah, so there's a lot of interest. That's great. Are you seeing this? Just popped into my head. Are you seeing any private interest? I don't know how I feel necessarily about carbon credits, but is there a private market to pay farmers for some of these ecosystem services?
Well, I mean, organic is the best. I think. I mean, I know what you're saying though. Like, is there some model besides carbon credits? I don't know of anything that I've seen. I mean, there's other eco labels up in the Northwest. There's Salmon Safe, and in any case, being part of an eco label can really help cover the costs of having more, supporting more diversity on your land. And you probably know with organic, it's not always the case that the yields are the same, but if the prices are higher, then that's a good thing.
I want to end on a hopeful note. I think the work you're doing is very hopeful, and I think that one of the reasons maybe why farmers just want to do this is because it is beautiful. Flowers are pretty and birds are fun to watch, and so I'm wondering what gives you hope right now.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you said beauty, because the world is a beautiful place, and we still have lots of parks that it's still functioning well, and so that makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that we figured out a lot of this stuff, like I was saying earlier. The intuition that we had, how this is working and why it's working, we're hearing now that yes, it's true. If you have healthy soils, you're going to have healthy plants, and if you have biological diversity, you're going to support food production, but also you're going to reduce damage, and you're going to have less food safety risk. And then it's also really hopeful that the younger generation, not just my generation, but the younger generation really cares about climate and really cares about biodiversity, and they're on board with us. So yeah, I feel really lucky to work in this realm and be part of the change.
Yeah, and thank you for being part of that. I love talking with people who have more experience and have had such an impact over the course of your life. So I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your taking the time to chat with me today.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me.
All right, everyone. Now is the time for my little spiel on the state of affairs in ag research and ag funding, and I guess the USDA in general. I know maybe people have already tuned out, but if you haven't, please keep listening. I do have some hesitation to share opinions that may be perceived as political. I don't want anyone to think I'm closed-minded or not willing to listen to differences in opinion. But I also feel I have to say something right now. Things are not okay at the USDA, in my opinion. And this affects the future of agriculture in this country, and more than just agriculture. They've put a freeze on grant programs, and we don't know when or if they plan to bring them back, even though they are congressionally mandated. They have fired all probationary employees. They are keeping some payments from farmers who have already done work on NRCS-sponsored projects to improve their farms. I think the situation with ag research and ag funding is nuanced, like everything in life. I have certainly witnessed what I think is crappy research getting funded by USDA and projects that don't align with what I think should be the direction of agriculture in this country, for sure. There's a lot I disagree with. But fundamentally, I think research for the public benefit is critical. If agricultural research isn't publicly funded, the only research that will happen is that which will result in a product to sell, whether it's a seed company that owns the rights to their genetics or a biotech company, even if it's a, quote unquote, regenerative biotech company or whatever they want to call themselves, with a microbial inoculant to sell, a fertilizer company, a pesticide company, whatever it is. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with private research and development. Go for it. I think there can be some great products to come out of private companies. But publicly funded research is where we get the knowledge of how birds fit into the farm ecosystem. It's how we learn that there are actually less human pathogens in biodiverse farm ecosystems than in a scorched earth approach. We need these data. Maybe you don't feel you need them. Maybe you feel that the ecological farming revolution is coming from within, not driven by any government-funded research. I get that. I can see that perspective. I can see how our food system has been pretty messed up by misguided research in the past. The history of USDA under the Reagan administration resisting and trying to bury organic ag is a great example. But we were making progress in reorienting the USDA research priorities to be more in line with ecological farming. There was a lot of effort to study climate adaptive practices and climate mitigation. There was increased funding for organic research, increased funding for SARE and farmer-led research. There were grant opportunities for people prioritizing ecological ways of transforming our food system, working with farmers to dig into ideas that are too labor-intensive for farmers to do on their own and that don't result in a product for a company to sell. I don't know when this episode will be released, and I don't know what the state of affairs will be then at USDA, but I guess I'm just asking to please pay attention. Please know that in the past, there have been calls for public comment on things like the priority areas for the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, the USDA agency that oversees research. They are required by law to listen to the public. They set the priorities, in theory, with public input, and reviewers are required to rank proposals according to how well they align with these priorities. This is how, in the past, we started to see more research on cover crops, everything from publicly funded cover crop breeding programs to my own work on cover crop-based no-till and small-scale organic production. This is how we started to see more research on participatory plant breeding for regionally adapted varieties, on the best ways to establish pollinator habitat. I just looked through the titles of recently funded NIFA research, and sure, yeah, you can do that. You can go online, you can just look. Like there's a database of NIFA funded research. And so sure, there are things that I don't understand what they are. But a lot of the titles are critical, relevant, and driven by the goal of making agriculture resilient and decreasing the negative impact of many current agricultural practices on the environment and even on human health. Again, I feel uncomfortable making this political. It's not in my nature to share political views publicly, especially because I know the agricultural crowd covers the full spectrum of beliefs. But I've read the Project 2025 chapter on the vision for USDA, and it is pretty clear that they want a complete transformation and corporate takeover. They want an agency that doesn't acknowledge the threats of climate change on agriculture or even acknowledge climate change at all. In fact, they call many environmental threats, quote unquote, speculative in nature. They don't actually name these threats. It's a sneaky way to avoid having to. But I'm guessing things that you and I likely care about, like the pollinator crisis, the contamination of ground and surface waters with agricultural chemicals, they probably consider those speculative in nature, just like climate change. There's so much in this document that is counter to a vision of future agriculture that I think many of you listening share with me. So keep paying attention. Don't disengage. I'm sad that I'm ending my part of this podcast on this note. I'm sitting here recording this and I have sweaty armpits. It's uncomfortable and it's a bummer, but I wanted to share something. I don't know what else to do. I know I asked Joanne to end on a hopeful note, and I think my hopeful note is all of you. There are so many people out there with a shared vision for a more ecological agriculture. So maybe both my hopeful note and my action item, because I was struggling, like, well, what is my point? What is the action item here? So I think it's this. When the time comes to provide public comment on the direction of the USDA, whether that's a, specific RFA or whatever it is, let's flood them. Let's flood them with comments about what the future of agriculture in this country should look like. Thanks for listening.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that episode. Always make sure to check the links in the show notes for how to follow our guests and hosts. The No-Till Market Garden podcast is a free show that is supported by folks like you who contribute every month over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. That support helps ensure all the shows we do, from the Seed Farmer podcast to the Winter Growers podcast, the Collaborative Farming podcast, the Composter podcast, Growers Daily, and of course, the No-Till Market Garden podcast, can continue to go and grow. You can also find books and hats, as well as an active forum over at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge thank you to editor Michael Sellis and producer Jackson Roulette for all their work on this show and the rest of the team over at no-tillgrowers.com. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and make sure you are subscribed wherever you're hearing this so you don't miss the next episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. See you then.
Bettering your business takes working with the best. With the James Hardie Alliance, you gain access to leads, training, networking, and support from the #1 brand of siding in North America. Achieve new levels of success by joining the James Hardie Alliance today.